They say the clothes make the man. For 24 years, I believed that a man was made of something else entirely. I thought a man was defined by the promises he kept, the sweat on his brow, and the honesty in his eyes. But on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in downtown Chicago, I learned that to the person who gave me life, I was worth nothing more than the price tag on my sleeve. I stood in the lobby of the Grand Horizon building, looking down at my reflection in the polished marble floor. The fabric of my jacket was slightly faded at the elbows. The trousers didn't perfectly match the hue of the coat, a secret only visible under the harsh fluorescent lights of a budget department store. It was a $40 suit, bought with money I had saved by skipping meals during my final semester. It was the absolute best I could do. To me, it represented survival. It represented a young man who had fought through the dark, who had worked 3-night shifts a week while maintaining a top-tier grade point average, just to stand on his own 2 feet. But to Richard Vance, my father, it was an insult to his legacy. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, expensive chime. The air inside the executive suite smelled of old money, imported cedar, and the distinct, suffocating scent of unearned arrogance. Richard sat behind a desk crafted from a single slab of black walnut. He didn't look up when I walked in. He let me stand there, the silence stretching between us like a physical wall. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a countdown to an execution. When he finally raised his eyes, there was no warmth. There was no proud recognition of a son who had just graduated against all odds. There was only a cold, calculating assessment. His eyes traveled from my worn leather shoes, up past my mismatched trousers, fixing finally on the cheap plastic buttons of my jacket. A slow, cruel smile crept across his face. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the smile a predator gives a cornered animal before the final blow. "Is this a joke, Leo?" His voice echoed, smooth, deep, and dripping with venom. "Did you walk through my lobby looking like a graveyard shift security guard just to embarrass me? Look at you. That jacket looks like it was stitched together from a trash bag. You look cheap. You look worthless. And frankly, you look exactly like what you are." The words didn't just hurt. They settled deep into my chest, heavy and suffocating. This was the man who had ignored my phone calls for 4 years. This was the man who had cut off every cent of support the moment I chose to study engineering instead of the corporate finance path he had laid out for me. I hadn't come to beg for money. I hadn't come to ask for a place in his megacorporation, Vance Global. I had come simply to hand him an invitation to my graduation ceremony. A simple gesture to say, "I made it, Dad. Even without you, I made it." But looking at him now, holding the small white envelope in my hand, I realized how incredibly foolish I had been. He didn't see a son. He saw a blemish on his perfect, high society image. "I came to invite you to see me walk the stage, Dad," I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the storm raging inside me. Richard let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Italian silk suit, a garment that probably cost more than my entire year of college tuition. He walked around the desk, stopping just inches from me. The scent of his expensive cologne filled the space, making me feel physically sick. "Walk the stage?" He sneered, glancing at the envelope in my hand as if it were contaminated. "To receive a degree from state school? Surrounded by people who wear $40 suits? Let me make something very clear to you, Leo. You are an embarrassment to the Vance name. You chose to walk away from my guidance, and this pathetic display is the result. You have no style, no class, and absolutely no future. I built an empire. I rubbed shoulders with billionaires. I will not sit in a crowded auditorium of nobodies to watch my biggest disappointment accept a piece of paper that qualifies him to be a middle manager at best." He reached out, took the envelope from my fingers, and without breaking eye contact, tossed it into the wastebasket beside his desk. When you can afford a real suit, and when you actually amount to something that makes a difference in the world, maybe then you can ask for 15 minutes of my time. Until then, stay out of my building. You're dismissed. The word hung in the air. Dismissed. Like an employee who had failed a basic task. Like a piece of garbage that had drifted into his pristine office. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. The tears welled up, hot and burning, but I forced them back down. A strange, icy calm washed over me. The pain of rejection faded, replaced by a sudden, crystal-clear realization. The man standing before me wasn't a father. He was just a bully with a large bank account. He believed that money gave him the right to crush a human soul. He believed his empire made him untouchable. I looked him dead in the eye, nodding slowly. "You're right, Richard," I said, intentionally dropping the title of Dad. "This suit is cheap, but it's paid for with honest work. Remember this day, because the next time I walk into this room, you won't be able to dismiss me." He laughed again, a sound of pure amusement at my defiance, and turned his back to me. I walked out of the office, the heavy oak doors closing behind me with a solid, definitive thud. As I rode the elevator back, down to the lobby, the shame turned into something else. It turned into iron. It turned into a quiet, burning resolve. He thought a $40 suit defined my worth. He had no idea what was brewing beneath it. The rain was pouring heavily when I stepped out onto the street, but I didn't care. I walked 10 blocks back to my cramped, damp basement apartment, the water soaking through my cheap shoes. The words cheap, worthless, and disappointment replayed in my mind like a broken record. But with every step, the rhythm of those words fueled a fire. My apartment was tiny. It consisted of a single mattress on the floor, a second-hand desk piled high with textbooks, and a laptop with a crack screen that buzzed whenever it ran too hot. This was my sanctuary. This was where I had spent the last 4 years inventing, coding, and dreaming. While my father was hosting lavish galas and drinking wine that cost thousands a bottle, I had been surviving on instant noodles and pure ambition. I stripped off the wetsuit jacket and hung it carefully on a plastic hanger. I didn't throw it away. I placed it right where I could see it every single day. It was my reminder. It was the physical manifestation of the vow I had just made to myself. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. On the screen was a project I had been working on in secret for over 18 months. In the world of engineering and logistics, there was a massive, systemic problem that every major shipping and manufacturing company faced: supply chain optimization. Companies were losing billions of dollars every year due to inefficient routing, poor inventory management, and predictive errors. My father's company, Vance Global, made its fortune primarily through shipping and international logistics. They were a titan, yes, but they were old school. They relied on legacy software, heavy-handed corporate contracts, and sheer size to crush competitors. I knew their vulnerabilities better than anyone because I had spent my adolescence listening to my father brag at the dinner table about how he manipulated markets and squeezed smaller suppliers dry. I had developed an algorithm, an artificial intelligence framework named Aegis. It didn't just track shipments. It predicted global market disruptions, automatically rerouted cargo in real time, and cut operational costs by an unprecedented 42%. It was a game changer. I knew its value, but up until today, I had been hesitant. I had been uncertain if I was ready to launch it into the brutal corporate wilderness. Richard's cruelty had stripped away all my hesitation. "You want to see what I amount to?" I whispered to the empty room, my fingers flying across the keyboard. "Just watch." The first step was securing funding without leaving a paper trail that could lead back to the Vance family name. If Richard found out his estranged son was launching a tech startup that could threaten his logistics empire, he would use his immense wealth to strangle my company in its cradle. I needed an ally, someone outside his circle of influence, someone who possessed the capital but lacked the technological edge. I spent the next 3 weeks crafting a flawless business proposal. I didn't sleep more than 3 hours a night. I survived on coffee and sheer adrenaline. I targeted a quiet, incredibly wealthy venture capital firm based out of Boston, Apex Horizons. They were known for investing in disruptive tech And more importantly, they had zero ties to Vance Global. The day of the pitch arrived. I didn't wear the $40 suit. I couldn't afford a luxury one yet, so I wore a simple, clean button-down shirt and black slacks. I didn't try to look like a millionaire. I let my intellect speak for itself. The meeting was held over a video conference call with 3 senior partners at Apex. They looked bored, tired, and ready to dismiss another arrogant tech graduate. But the moment I initiated the demonstration of Aegis, the atmosphere changed completely. I ran a live simulation using real-time maritime data, showing how my software could save a mid-sized shipping fleet $12 million in a single storm event by predicting port congestion 3 days in advance. The lead partner, a sharp-eyed woman named Eleanor Sterling, no relation to my father, just a cosmic irony, leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice sharp and precise. "This data, if this algorithm is as scalable as you claim, you aren't just looking at a software startup. You're looking at something that could render traditional logistics companies completely obsolete within a decade. Why haven't you taken this to the major players? Vance Global, for instance? They would pay a fortune for this." I felt a cold chill run down my spine, but my voice remained completely calm. "Vance Global is a relic of the past, Miss Sterling. They rely on size, not intelligence. I don't want to sell my software to a dinosaur so they can bury it to protect their old business model. I want to build the future, and I want Apex to help me build it." Eleanor stared at me through the screen for what felt like an eternity. A small, knowing smile appeared on her lips. She recognized the look in my eyes. It was the look of someone who wasn't just working for a paycheck. It was the look of a man who was on a mission. "We will offer you $5 million in seed funding," she said quietly, "in exchange for 30% equity. But we have one condition, Leo. We want a working prototype deployed in a live market within 6 months. Can you deliver?" I looked over at the cheap suit jacket hanging on the back of my closet door. "I'll have it ready in 3, I replied. The next 2 years became a blur of endless work, high-stakes decisions, and exponential growth. We chose the name Aegis Logistics Systems. We didn't rent a flashy office in downtown Chicago. We didn't throw launch parties or put my face on tech magazines. I insisted on absolute secrecy. We operated out of a plain, unmarked building in the suburbs, flying completely under the radar. While the world remained unaware of who was running Aegis, the industry definitely felt our presence. Our strategy was simple but devastating. We targeted the medium-sized shipping companies that had been bullied and squeezed by Vance Global for decades. These were companies that were desperately struggling to survive under the heavy tariffs and predatory pricing models my father enforced. We offered them the Aegis platform at a fraction of the cost, guaranteeing an immediate increase in their profit margins. The results were miraculous. A mid-sized supplier in Ohio that was on the verge of bankruptcy suddenly optimized its routes so efficiently that they won a massive government contract right out from under my father's nose. A shipping line in the Atlantic cut its fuel consumption by half, allowing them to lower their prices and draw clients away from Vance Global. Slowly, quietly, the tide began to turn. Like water seeping into the foundation of a massive concrete tower, Aegis was eroding Vance Global's market share from the bottom up. Every evening, after my team had gone home, I would sit alone in my office, reviewing the financial reports of Vance Global. Because they were a publicly traded company, their losses were out in the open for anyone who knew where to look. For the first time in 20 years, their quarterly earnings were dipping. First by 2%, then by 5%, then by a staggering 12% in a single winter. I watched as my father tried to fight back using his old tactics. He slashed prices, he threatened suppliers, he launched expensive marketing campaigns. But you cannot fight mathematics with marketing. You cannot defeat an advanced, predictive artificial intelligence with old-world arrogance. He didn't understand why he was losing. He thought it was a temporary market downturn. He had no idea that a ghost was haunting his balance sheets. One evening, Eleanor Sterling walked into my office, holding a glass of scotch. She set it down on my desk and sat in the chair opposite me. "You're doing it, Leo," she said, looking at the charts displayed on my monitors. "Vance Global is bleeding. Their stock dropped another 4 points today. Wall Street is starting to panic. The board of directors is demanding answers from Richard Vance." I leaned back, staring at the glowing lines of data. "It's not enough," I said softly. Eleanor sighed, her expression turning serious. "Leo, I've known you for 2 years now. You've made millions. You've built one of the most successful tech companies in the country before the age of 27. But you still live like a student. You still wear simple clothes. You still look at these financial reports like a man preparing for war. What did Richard Vance do to you?" I remained silent for a long moment. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small, faded photograph. It was a picture of my mother, who had passed away when I was 12. She was a kind, gentle woman who had spent her final years being ignored and emotionally neglected by a husband who cared only for power. After she died, Richard had looked at me not as a grieving son, but as an administrative problem to be managed. He told me I was worthless because of the clothes I wore, I said quietly, looking at Eleanor. He told me I would never amount to anything. He built an empire on the broken spirits of anyone who couldn't offer him a profit. I don't want to just compete with him, Eleanor. I want to buy him out. I want to sit in that black walnut chair and show him exactly what his worthless son created. Eleanor looked at me, a profound look of respect and a hint of fear in her eyes. A buyout of a public giant like Vance Global requires billions, Leo. Even with our growth, we don't have that kind of liquid capital. If we try to launch a hostile takeover, he will see us coming. He will rally his institutional investors and block us. He won't see us coming, I replied, a cold smile forming on my face. Because we aren't going to buy his stock on the open market. We're going to wait until he is forced to sell it to save himself. "And how do you plan to force his hand?" she asked. "The Vanguard contract," I answered. The Vanguard contract was the holy grail of international logistics. It was a multi-billion-dollar, 10-year exclusive contract with the United States Department of Defense and major international trade coalitions to manage all military and humanitarian supply lines across the globe. For the past 15 years, Vance Global had held that contract. It was the absolute backbone of their wealth. It accounted for over 60% of their annual revenue. The contract was up for renewal in exactly 6 months. Richard Vance assumed it was a formality. He assumed no one else had the scale or the security clearance to challenge him. He was entirely wrong. The preparation for the Vanguard bid was intense. It required a level of security and precision that tested every single employee at Aegis. We knew that if Richard got even a whisper of what we were doing, he would use his political connections to disqualify us before the bidding even began. I live in the office. My team worked in rotating shifts. We mapped out every single logistical route on Earth, demonstrating how our software could move cargo through conflict zones, natural disasters, and economic blockades without a single hour of delay. We proved that we could save the government over $800 million a year while drastically increasing delivery speeds. Meanwhile, Richard Vance was growing desperate. The steady decline of his company's stock was attracting severe media scrutiny. I watched his interviews on financial news networks. He looked older. The arrogant, untouchable smirk was gone, replaced by a tense, strained smile. He blamed the losses on global instability, supply chain anomalies, and unregulated tech disruptions. He still hadn't realized that the disruption had a name and that it shared his own. One afternoon, 3 weeks before the Vanguard proposals were due, my assistant informed me that a representative from a corporate intelligence firm was trying to access our server data. They had attempted a sophisticated digital breach. I traced the IP address within minutes. It led straight back to a shell company owned by Vance Global. Richard was finally panicking. He was starting to feel the walls close in, and true to his nature, He was turning to underhanded tactics to discover who his mysterious rival was. I didn't block the breach immediately. Instead, I allowed them to see exactly what I wanted them to see. I let them download a heavily encrypted file that contained our past financial performance and our projected growth. But I completely wiped any mention of my identity, my executive team, or our specific bidding strategy for Vanguard. I wanted him to see how powerful we were. I wanted him to see that he was fighting an invisible giant. I wanted the fear to keep him up at night. The day of the Vanguard presentation arrived. It was held at a secure federal facility in Washington, D.C. The bidding process was strictly confidential. Each company was assigned a private holding room and a specific time slot to present before a panel of military generals, government officials, and economic experts. I arrived early. I walked down the long, sterile corridor toward our assigned holding room. I was dressed in a simple, dark blue suit. It wasn't $40 anymore. It was high-quality, tailored fabric, but it was plain, unpretentious, and devoid of any flashy luxury branding. I carried a single black briefcase. As I approached the double doors of the main auditorium, the doors opened, and a group of men stepped out. At the center of the group was Richard Vance. He was surrounded by a flock of vice presidents, lawyers, and assistants, all dressed in immaculate luxury attire. Richard was talking loudly, his voice filled with that familiar, booming confidence. He had just finished his presentation, and from the look on his face, he believed he had completely nailed it. He believed the contract was already his. Then his eyes landed on me. He stopped mid-sentence. The crowd of executives around him stopped too, sensing the sudden shift in their CEO's demeanor. Richard stared at me, his eyes narrowing. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He didn't recognize me as the CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech company. He recognized me as the boy he had thrown out of his office 2.5 years ago. "Lau," he said, his voice dropping its corporate charm, replaced by a tone of pure disbelief. "What on earth are you doing here? This is a restricted federal briefing. Security should have stopped you at the gate." I stopped a few feet from him. I didn't flinch. I didn't look down. I held his gaze with total tranquility. "I have a security clearance. Richard," I said calmly. "I'm here for the afternoon session." One of his vice presidents, a man who used to look past me at family dinners, stepped forward. "Mr. Vance, do you know this person? He's listed as the primary presenter for Aegis Logistics Systems." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face lost all its color. The blood drained from his cheeks so fast he looked as though he might faint. He looked at me, then down at the badge clipped to my jacket, which read, "Leo Vance, CEO, Aegis Systems." "Aegis?" Richard whispered, the word sounding like chalk scraping against a blackboard. "You're Aegis? The software company, the one that's been systematically stealing our clients?" "We didn't steal them, Richard," I replied, my voice cool and even. "We just offer them efficiency and respect. Things your company stopped providing a long time ago." Richard took a step closer, his hands trembling slightly, though he tried to hide it by clenching his fists. The corporate mask was slipping, revealing the angry, desperate bully underneath. "You think you can play games with me?" he hissed, keeping his voice low so the surrounding officials wouldn't hear. "You think you can come here with your little software program and compete for a federal defense contract? This is the big leagues, boy. I have decades of experience. I have infrastructure. You're a child playing with toys. I don't care what kind of lucky breaks you've had in the private sector. You cannot touch Vance Global here." I looked at him, feeling a profound sense of pity. He was still relying on his old illusions of grandeur. He still thought his size made him bulletproof. "The board is waiting for me. Richard," I said softly, checking my watch. "You should probably head to the airport. Your stock is going to open very low tomorrow morning." I walked past him, my shoulder brushing his expensive silk jacket. He didn't move. He stood there, frozen in the hallway, as his executives whispered frantically among themselves. I walked into the presentation room, the heavy doors closing behind me, shutting out his world completely. The presentation before the Vanguard panel lasted 3 hours. I didn't give a speech filled with corporate buzzwords or promises of loyalty. I simply let Aegis speak for itself. I showed them live simulations of how our software handled absolute chaos, simulated port strikes, fuel shortages, cyber warfare attacks. Every single question the generals threw at me, my software answered with absolute mathematical precision. When I stepped out of the room, I knew we had won. It wasn't an act of arrogance. It was an act of certainty. We were simply better. The official announcement came 4 days later. The Department of Defense issued a press release stating that the Vanguard contract had been awarded to Aegis Logistics Systems, citing a revolutionary leap in technological efficiency and unprecedented cost reduction. The reaction on Wall Street was instantaneous and catastrophic for Vance Global. When the market opened at 9:30 a.m., the sell orders for Vance Global stock poured in like an avalanche. Institutional investors, realizing that the company had lost 60% of its future revenue, panicked. The stock price didn't just drop, it plummeted off a cliff. By noon, trading of the stock had to be temporarily halted to prevent a total market meltdown. By the end of the week, Vance Global had lost 70% of its valuation. The company was in a state of absolute freefall. They were facing immediate loan defaults, massive corporate lawsuits, and a very real prospect of total liquidation. I sat in my office, watching the financial news networks cover the story. The anchors were calling it the most sudden and dramatic collapse of a corporate titan in modern history. They showed footage of the Vance Global building, the very building where I had been told I was worthless, now surrounded by reporters and anxious employees. Then, my personal phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was an unlisted number, but I knew exactly who it was. I let it ring for a few seconds before answering. Leo, his voice came through the speaker. It didn't sound like Richard Vance anymore. The booming, dominant authority was completely gone. It sounded like an old, exhausted man. His voice cracked with a mixture of anger, defeat, and a desperate plea. "I'm listening, Richard," I said calmly. "We need to talk," he said, clearing his throat, trying to regain a shred of his dignity. "A formal meeting. In my office. Tomorrow morning. We can discuss a partnership. A merger. Aegis and Vance Global. Together, we can dominate the entire global market. I am willing to offer you a seat on the board. We can settle this as family." Family. The word felt incredibly hollow coming from his mouth. He hadn't used that word when I was starving in a basement apartment. He hadn't used that word when he threw my graduation invitation into the trash. He was using it now because it was the only weapon he had left. "I told you before, Richard," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "The next time I walk into your office, you won't be able to dismiss me. I will be there tomorrow at 10 o'clock. But we won't be discussing a partnership." "What do you mean?" he asked, a tremor of fear in his voice. "I mean, you should ensure the office is clean," I said, and hung up the phone. I stood up and walked over to my closet. I reached past the tailored suits I now owned and pulled out the old, faded $40 suit jacket. It was dusty, the fabric felt slightly rough to the touch, and the plastic buttons looked incredibly cheap under my office lights. I smiled. I took it off the hanger. I was going to wear it one last time. The next morning, the Grand Horizon building looked exactly the same from the outside, but the energy inside was entirely different. The bustling, confident atmosphere of the lobby had been replaced by a heavy, anxious dread. Employees were gathered in small groups, whispering nervously, clutching cardboard boxes filled with their personal belongings. The empire was crumbling, and everyone knew it. I walked through the lobby, wearing my $40 suit jacket. People stared at me. Some of the security guards who had watched me get thrown out years ago recognized me now from the recent tech news coverage. They didn't stop me. They didn't ask for a badge. They simply bowed their heads slightly, opening the executive elevator for me with absolute deference. The ride up to the top floor was silent. When the doors opened into the executive suite, there were no assistants sitting at the desks. The phones were ringing off the hook, completely ignored. The entire floor felt like a ghost ship. I walked down the long corridor and pushed open the heavy oak doors of Richard's office without knocking. He was sitting behind his black walnut desk, just like before. But the man sitting there looked 20 years older. His hair was disheveled, his tie was loosened, and his desk was covered in stacks of legal documents, margin calls, and financial statements. He looked up when I entered, his eyes hollow and bloodshot. Then his gaze drifted to my jacket. He recognized it instantly. He stared at the faded fabric, the cheap buttons, the slightly worn elbows. A look of profound realization and deep shame washed over his face. He remembered every single word he had said to me in this exact room. "You wore it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I told you it was paid for with honest work." "Richard," I said, walking over and standing in front of his desk. I didn't sit down. I let him look up at me from his chair. "You told me that when I could afford a real suit, and when I amounted to something, I could ask for 15 minutes of your time. I don't need 15 minutes. I only need 5. Richard leaned forward, placing his trembling hands on the desk. "Leo, please. You have to understand. The corporate world, it's brutal. I had to be tough. I wanted you to prove yourself. I wanted to see if you had the fire in you to survive. It was a lesson." "A lesson?" I asked, a sharp, cold laugh escaping my lips. "No, it wasn't. Don't rewrite history to save your conscience. You didn't want me to prove myself. You wanted to crush me because I didn't bow to your authority. You looked at a young man who had nothing but a dream and an honest heart, and you tried to make him feel like dirt because his clothes didn't match your standard of wealth." Richard looked down at the documents on his desk, his shoulders sinking. "What do you want, Leo? Are you here to mock me? Are you here to watch me lose everything?" I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single, thick legal document bound in black leather. I set it down on the walnut desk, sliding it across to him. "This is an unconditional buyout offer from Aegis Systems," I said clearly. "We are purchasing all remaining assets, infrastructure, and outstanding shares of Vance Global at a price of 12 cents on the dollar. It is just enough to pay off your immediate corporate debts and prevent your board members from facing criminal prosecution for insolvency. It will leave you with nothing, Richard. The brand name Vance Global will be erased from existence. The company will be entirely absorbed into Aegis." Richard stared at the document as if it were a bomb. "Nothing?" he stammered. "I built this company from the ground up. I spent 30 years of my life creating this empire. You can't just take it all away and leave me with nothing." "I'm not taking it away," I replied softly. "Your own arrogance took it away. You relied on intimidation instead of innovation. You treated people like numbers instead of humans. You thought your wealth made you a god, but it just made you blind. You didn't see the world changing around you, and you didn't see that the son you discarded was the one who was going to build the future." He looked up at me, tears of pure despair welling in his eyes. The powerful, untouchable Richard Vance was completely broken. He reached for a pen, his hand shaking so violently he could barely hold it. He looked at the signature line on the document, then back up at my cheap suit. "If I sign this," he whispered, "what happens to me?" "You get to walk away without a prison sentence for corporate default," I said. "And you get to live the rest of your life knowing exactly how much a $40 suit is actually worth." With a trembling hand, Richard signed his name at the bottom of the contract. The empire was officially gone. It belonged to me. I didn't take the black walnut desk. I didn't move my office into the top floor of the Grand Horizon building. In fact, one of my first acts as the new owner of the infrastructure was to sell the building entirely and transition all the operations to our modern, collaborative campus in the suburbs. I ensured that every single lower-level employee of Vance Global kept their job, with better pay, better hours, and a corporate culture rooted in mutual respect rather than fear. A few weeks after the buyout was finalized, I stood in my new office, looking out the window at the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the streets below. I looked over at the corner of my office. There, resting inside a beautiful, custom-made glass display case, was the $40 suit jacket. It was no longer a symbol of shame, or even a symbol of revenge. It had become something much greater. Eleanor Sterling walked into my room, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to me and stood beside me, looking at the display case. "You know, Leo," she said with a soft smile, "that jacket is probably the most expensive piece of clothing in the world now. It cost you $40 then, but it built a multi-billion-dollar company." I took a sip of the coffee, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace inside my chest. The anger that had fueled me for years was entirely gone. The desire to hurt my father had melted away the moment he signed that paper. What was left was simply the truth. It didn't build the company, Eleanor, I said quietly. The person inside it did. Revenge is a strange thing. When you are consumed by it, you think that destroying your enemy will bring you happiness. But true victory doesn't come from watching someone else fall. True victory comes from raising yourself up to a level where their opinion of you can no longer touch your soul. My father thought wealth was measured by the price of a suit, the size of an office, or the number of people you could command. He lived his whole life in a prison of his own vanity, and in the end, that prison collapsed on him. I had started my journey trying to prove my worth to a man who couldn't see past appearances. But along the way, I discovered my own value. I learned that true power doesn't lie in the ability to crush others. It lies in the ability to build something that lasts, to treat people with dignity, and stand tall no matter how cheap your clothes might look to the world. I turned away from the window and walked back to my desk, leaving the past exactly where it belonged, behind a pane of glass. A reminder of where I came from, and a testament to the fact that no one can ever define your worth except you.